if you'd like to follow along, we're going to take a look at Acts chapter 17. We finished up our second lesson about pop culture and using it for modern day messaging last Sunday. By the way, I just realized the heading of this particular lesson that I just handed out, I was using an older version and it says modern day parables. It actually should say modern day messaging. But in any event, we finished up looking at the Star Wars, at least some aspects of Star Wars last week. And this week we're going to move on to something else. But as has been the plan as we've gone along, we're going to start by looking at a specific instance of ministry in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 17, verses 15 through 34. And I would like to get somebody to read for us Acts chapter, let me see here, is it 15, is that right? 18. Let me see, hang on here. Yeah, no, actually it is 15 because I do want to kind of set the stage here. Could somebody read for me verses 15 through 21 to start with?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, is it Acts 17?
17, starting with 15, yeah.
Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue that with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new.
Okay, thank you, Ian. All right, so Paul is in Athens, and what does he start seeing in Athens that really bugs him?
Idols.
Idols. Lots and lots and lots of idols. Now the Greeks have a very extensive mythology, and this is near the end of the Greek, well, it's really kind of beyond the end of it, but it's the end of the Greek classical period where their mythology had kind of reached its peak. And at this point, they're kind of gradually falling away from that. By the time the Romans get involved and have taken over Greece, and they've actually adapted their idols and their mythology to create their own, the Romans have kind of replaced that, and so the Greeks are more into philosophy at this point than they are necessarily into the mythology and the idol worship that we're used to. But there are still a lot of idols and a lot of gods that they've come up with and everything else, and they're going to be all over Athens. And certainly when you think about the Forum in Athens, and there's a Forum in Rome as well, but the Forum in Athens, it would have been populated with all sorts of idols to all sorts of different gods. And because the Greeks were, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe agnostic isn't quite the right word. It's more that the Greeks were afraid of missing out on a god that might be real. So they wanted to make sure that they worshipped all the gods, just in case. They didn't really take any of them that seriously, but it's kind of like, let's sort of hedge our bets a little bit here, you know. We don't want to put too much money on no gods. If it turns out there are some gods, we got to put a little money on them too, just to make sure we keep them happy. It's a very transactional kind of relationship they have with their gods. Going back to the earliest ideas about it, where you have gods that are deities of different aspects of important things of life, gods of the harvest and of the sun and of the rain and different things like that, and you worship those gods and you serve those gods and you sacrifice to those gods because you want them to give you good harvests and, you know, sun when you need it and rain when you need it and stuff like that. So they have a transactional relationship with their gods. We'll do something for you and you'll do something for us. And even though they hardly believe in them anymore, they still want to make sure that just in case they are real, or some of them are real, we don't want to get them mad at us. So we want to keep on doing stuff with them. But by and large, they've kind of replaced a lot of their deep-seated idolatry with philosophy. And there's two different kinds of philosophers that they mention here: Epicureans and Stoic. Anybody know what Epicurean philosophers believe or what they chase after?
Sensual pleasures.
Okay, So Epicureans believe in chasing after things that make you feel good, make you happy. Okay? What about Stoics? The name actually kind of says
Sounds
that.
kind of like the opposite.
It is, yeah. You know, you don't enjoy anything too much. You just kind of. Now, to be fair, to be Stoic is not to be like angry all the time. That would actually be going the wrong direction. A Stoic is someone who wants to find a sense of balance and very little deviation from kind of just being on balance all the time. So nothing's too funny, nothing's too fun, nothing's too depressing, nothing makes them too angry. The goal is to basically try to, it's actually kind of like Mr. Spock, is the, use a pop culture reference in this context, trying to keep emotion from impacting the decisions that you make and stuff like that. So you kind of have these two different approaches. One that's very much about what makes me happy, and the other one's very much about just kind of trying to reason your way through things and not let emotions get in the way. So these are our two philosophers, two groups of philosophers. And they're talking to Paul because what Paul is saying is interesting to them as a matter of philosophy. And what do we see? What does the scriptures say in terms of what these philosophers and these people spend all their time doing?
Seeking more knowledge and understanding of things that they've not heard.
Okay, so they're looking for new stuff, new ideas, new things to think about. The way Luke writes it kind of makes it sound like he's not real impressed with that approach. You know, because he says they spend their time doing nothing other than just telling each other about new stuff. You know, and so to what extent Luke was being critical of that, it's hard to know for sure. But certainly the Romans looked at the Greeks at this point as being kind of past their prime. A lot of Roman governmental structures, a lot of Roman ideas and philosophy had come from the Greeks, but now they kind of looked at the Greeks as a culture that had kind of moved on past the relevance that they'd had at one time, and were kind of just, you know, just sort of sitting around talking about stuff, almost, because the Romans had replaced them as the moving nation, the moving ideas that were the modern world. And it kind of seems like Luke is kind of saying that same thing in a way here. So they just like to sit around and talk about ideas and learn new stuff. And there's nothing wrong with learning new stuff, don't misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with incorporating new ideas. Luke seems to be saying, well, the problem is that that's all they do, is they just think about stuff. Okay? All right, let's go on. Somebody read for me verses 22 through, let's see, where do we want to go to? 31.
And Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus, whatever it is.
Areopagus.
Areopagus. And he said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you're very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship in ignorance, I now proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. And he made from one every nation of mankind to live all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. Being then the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof of all men by raising him from the dead." Okay, so, thank you, Steve. So, I forgot to mention this a second ago, one of the things that's kind of cool here is that Paul is actually invited, he goes and he starts teaching in the synagogue, like he always has been doing on his missionary trips.
and working with the Jews and trying to bring them over. But the Athenians, the Greeks themselves, hear him. Some of them, presumably, probably some Jewish, they call it God-fearing Greeks who would have been interested in and pursuing Judaism and perhaps attending the synagogues. Unlike the temple, you don't have to be a full-blooded Jew to be able to go into the synagogues, and it was pretty normal for there to be within any city where there were synagogues to be some Greeks or Romans or foreigners who weren't necessarily Jewish. And presumably then they went and told other people about what they'd heard, which is exactly how this is supposed to work. So they then invited Paul to come and speak to all these philosophers who gather together at this Areopagus, which is this gathering place for the philosophers and thinkers and stuff like that. And so Paul is handed an opportunity to speak in a way that he rarely is. It's not often. I mean, more often than not, the way Paul gets to speak is either by going to a synagogue where they don't like him very much, or by getting in trouble and having to take advantage of some sort of crisis to have a chance to, he's in jail, and that's where he gets his chance to talk to the prisoners, or later on to the jailer, or different things like that. So this is kind of unusual, that for once he's actually got a chance to get up and speak, and they've asked him to be there, and they're listening to him, and because of the way the Greeks approach things, even if they don't like what he has to say, they're not going to throw him out and have him beaten or something like that. They're just going to say, we don't care, So this is a better opportunity than Paul usually gets. And so you can see that this is one of the few times where we actually see a speech, a sermon being delivered by an evangelist actually written out in the book of Acts. Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost is one. Most of the rest of the time, though, with a few exceptions, it's just little bits. So when Paul talks to the jailer, it quotes him as saying, don't kill yourself, here's, and when Peter talks to Cornelius, there's the beginning of what he's saying, and then the Holy Spirit comes on. But this is one of the few where we actually get the whole thing. This is the whole thing he said. So what does he do? How does he incorporate what he's already seen in Athens into what he says?
He starts out something in common with, hey, I see you're really religious. So that gets them thinking, oh yeah, we are. And then they'll start listening to him. And then he goes on from there with the unknown God.
Okay.
And then he explains in their ignorance, they have found out who they're trying to make sure they don't miss him.
Right.
And then he tries to explain it from there. And he kind of gets that opportunity and make sure that they're listening to him, and that's how he starts the whole thing off.
Okay, so go ahead, Ian.
This is also a really, really good example of how we ought to be evangelizing. Because the very first, he didn't go in guns a-blazing saying what they're doing wrong.
Right.
He opened it up with a compliment, and then he told them about God, and he told them about Jesus, and he didn't anywhere in there say, what you're doing is going to send you to hell.
Good.
That's a really good way to turn something
that's
off.
true. That's true.
And it has before.
It is interesting because the term he uses, religious, can also mean superstitious, which could be taken as an insult, but in the context that he's using it, it doesn't seem like he's meaning it that way. Like he doesn't say, I see that you're all superstition, boy are you a bunch of losers. Instead he uses it, as you say, to say, there's all these gods. And I see you're so concerned about making sure you please the gods or don't anger the gods that you've even set up an altar to an unknown god just in case you miss somebody, So he's using their culture, using what is, something that they know about as a jumping off point to get into his discourse. Now, why do you suppose he did this? We don't see this very often where the speakers are using, well, that's actually not true. I'm going to get ahead of my. Why do you suppose he did this? Let me just stop there. Ask the question and let you answer without me editorializing. Why do you think he used the unknown God as the place to start from instead of just jumping into this normal story?
Well, because he was Jewish, it's kind of a little surprising that a Pharisee would be invited into this environment.
True.
Because they said, we've heard all that stuff. And you have a whole lineage of how you got to, where you are. Well, he starts with their lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And doesn't talk about Abraham, doesn't talk about David, doesn't talk about all that.
Which is very different from the sermons that we've seen, the ones that we have seen written out before this. Why?
Because they're not Jewish.
It's his audience, right?
Yeah.
It's a question, to use jumping away from this for just a second here, the question that I've sometimes asked by people when I mention, and I try not to bring this up like at the outset, but it does eventually come out, does your church accept people who are homosexual? Well, we accept them, but we don't accept that practice. We're not going to say it's okay to do that. We're going to love you, and we're going to try to show you God's way to do things. And that usually doesn't really help very much. It's a little nicer than saying, no, we're going to burn your house down. But it doesn't usually get you very far. But then the follow-up question is, well, then why doesn't Jesus say anything about homosexuality? Well, Jesus was a Jew talking to a bunch of Jews. They already knew they were supposed to stone people who were like that. So you don't have to tell people that it's wrong to do something if they all know it's wrong to do something. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is taking common ideas about morality and he's saying, I want you to be even better than this. But given that there's an absolute prohibition on that kind of behavior in the Old Testament, why would you need to even mention it? Paul, on the other hand, has to say a lot about it because he's dealing with Gentiles, and it's a very common situation with them. So we have to remember when we look at the Scriptures that a lot of times the people who are speaking to a specific audience, and while we certainly can draw from that things that can apply to us even if we're not that audience, we do have to be a little bit cautious that we don't assume that something that might be context-driven is necessarily directed at us. And so we want to be a little smart about that. In this case, Paul chooses to direct what at them based on their culture because he knows that they're going to understand better and they're going to listen more if he starts from the perspective of their culture. As I think as Steve said, if he launches into, here's here's the background of the Jews and here's, the God created the world, all these different things, their eyes are going to glaze over. And as Steve, I know Steve has said this part of it, they've heard that before. They've heard from Pharisees before, or they've heard indirectly what Pharisees and what Jews believe. And what Paul is teaching and preaching is a step beyond Judaism. He's not stopping with just, you've got to repent and you've got to become a Jew, and you've got to be circumcised, you've got to follow the old law. He's stepping way beyond that, preaching a message that is meant for everybody. It's not a message of you have to become a Jew to be like a Jew to be saved. This is designed to reach you wherever you are, and to make it possible for you to be saved. But to get there, he needs a pathway. And notice the pathway that he takes. He starts off by saying, okay, you've got the unknown God. That unknown God is actually the God. All the rest of this stuff is actually just, made by us, made up by humans. But the real God is the one who created everything. And then notice what he does here again. He's not done going back to their stuff. What's the next thing he does that harkens back to their stuff, to their culture? What does he reference? Let's see, if you look in verse 28, I think it is, what does it say?
We're his offspring.
We're his offspring, but how does he bring that back to the Greek ideas?
Even as some of your own poets have said.
Exactly. Thank you. So he is saying, you guys know about this. You guys know about this because your poets have said this too. And for the Greeks, this is a pretty important idea because what he's saying is God made you. God, and you are made in his image. And that's a really important concept because the Greek concept of where people came from was kind of amorphous. The gods were responsible for it, but they didn't exactly do it like the way God did it, where, created and breathed life into them. It was kind of more like an afterthought kind of a thing. And so Paul is trying to convey an idea of a much more intensely personal relationship between the creator and the created, and in a much more intentional and directed purpose of God in creating mankind. But notice what he does here then is he uses that idea that the divine nature is something that's been put into all of us as well. Not that we're God, don't misunderstand me here, but that the divine nature, the spark of life, that spark of the soul, whatever you want to call it, that's been put into all of us. And out of that, notice what he says here. He says, because we are the children of God, the creation of God, we ought not to think that God's nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by man. What business would man have of trying to make a God when he is made by God? That's really the idea that he's trying to convey. He's trying to say idolatry is a lie, not because not in terms of you're going to go to hell because you believe it or anything else. What he's trying to say is, look, you can figure this out for yourselves. You're philosophers, you're thinkers. Think your way through this. If God made us, then why in the world would we think that the gods are made by us in exchange, in return? That imagery and manipulable things, stone and wood and all that stuff, that is somehow God. And so then I love what he says here, because he says, therefore, he's overlooked the times of ignorance. You didn't know, but now he's making sure the whole world knows what the gospel is. And he's going to judge the world in righteousness for the man he's appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. Now notice in there, he doesn't actually get to the details of the gospel message. And we're going to see why not in just a second here. But any thoughts before we jump to the last bit of this in the scripture? All right, so somebody read for me verses 32 through the end of the chapter. That'll take us to 34.
Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to scoff, but others said, We shall hear from you again concerning this. So Paul went out from among them. But some men joined him and believed, among whom were Dionysius and Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them.
All right, so what happens then is he gets to the point of talking about resurrection, and what happens? What does the crowd do?
They mocked him, scoffed.
They start mocking him, they maybe start arguing with each other, because some of them are saying, we want to hear some more from you. But what's clear is, regardless of who we're talking about, they don't want him to keep talking right then. Because one group says, this is ridiculous, and the other group says, we'd like to hear some more from you, but later, not right now. And so what they do is they kind of cut him off before he can get into the actual heart of the gospel message. One of the interesting things about this is this is oftentimes counted as one of the great gospel sermons, certainly in the scriptures, because there aren't very many laid out. But the irony of this is it's a relatively unsuccessful sermon. For being as well thought out as it was, and being as doing as good a job as referencing their culture and bringing their ideas into it as a jumping off point for teaching it, he never even gets to finish the sermon, and very few people actually listen to him, certainly not among the Greeks anyway. And so he ends up converting a few and then having to move on to Corinth after that. So what we see then is that just because you do something really clever or you tie into something really good doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to get the result you want. And I think that's an important principle for us when it comes to evangelism, is that just because we think we got a really neat idea, or we make a really clever comment or a really smart argument to someone, doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to change them. Why not? Why did so few of these Greeks really listen, or more accurately, why did so few of them actually internalize what Paul was saying and do anything with it? What do you think?
Well, I think it kind of goes back, I view this as sort of the Romans first chapter, where it talks about people, their intelligence, their own level of wisdom, all the intellectual, these are a bunch of intellectuals sitting around going, okay, I hear you, interesting, but I'm still open.
Mm-hmm. So
that's my thought.
So we got there's two ideas in there, Steve, I think. So one of them, maybe more, but there's two that are jumping out at me. One is, in Romans we have that notion of that downward spiral of sin. And the further down you get in that, the harder it is for you to recognize truth when you hear it, and the harder it is for you to get out of that. And so maybe because of the idolatry and the way their culture had been for so long, they're way down that spiral, and they're not internalizing anything Paul's saying, because they're a long way away from being able to listen to that and hear it, because their consciences are seared and that kind of stuff. The other thing I hear is this idea that they are so wrapped up in just hearing stuff that they're not really interested in actually doing anything with it. You know, they're just listening to things and talking about things, but they're not doing anything with it. Does that sound anything like our society today? Right? I mean, number one, we can certainly see where we are a long way down that spiral of sin and further corruption that we see in Romans. But number two, we endlessly talk about things. If you go online, The development of chat forums is probably the second worst thing about the internet behind the prevalence of pornography on the internet. But the development of chat forums and just, I mean, it's everywhere. You can find people talking endlessly about almost anything, and it may be fascinating for a while, but eventually, hopefully you start to realize, wait a minute, this is not a good use of my time. I can get sucked into this and spend a day looking at these things. Sue?
Well, I've talked to different people throughout the years that have approached you in a way that almost immediately puts you on guard or turns you off.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, even when somebody is making some sense, you're still going to have that guard up a little bit. And so you've got a little thicker shell. It's a little harder. And
Yeah.
people are, because I mean, people have come to the house and said, you know, the world's going to end soon. And it's kind of, whoa. Because
Should I call the Department of Homeland Security?
Good, we've been looking forward to it.
It is, you're right. And I think that's part of the reason why it is incumbent on us to approach evangelism in the most positive and least confrontational way possible. Not without any confrontation or without any negativity, because you can't really teach, we're looking at this in the sermon series, you can't teach about forgiveness without people understanding sin. If you don't understand there's a problem, why would you need a solution? But it is incumbent on us to find as many ways as possible to help people to listen. Jesus did that with the way that he taught. And we see this here in what Paul is doing as well, trying to help people to listen. But it's also important for us to realize that not everybody is going to listen just because we got a good idea about how to talk.
One of the first parables, if not the first one, was the sower and the seed. And if you don't, you have to understand that we sow the seed. But I think even Paul realized, you know, it's only going to soak in so deep with certain people. And so they asked him, you know, tell us about what, you know, your stuff. He's like, okay, I will. And at the end of the whole thing, there's 2 people named that believed what he was saying.
Yeah.
And one of them was a member of the council, another one was a woman, and then it says, and others.
And others.
And
Who are
so-
apparently not well enough and known for them to give a name for them.
You're not going to win over Athens in
Right.
a day, for sure.
Rome wasn't built in a day, Athens wasn't converted in a day.
Right.
But I think that that's the last really important lesson here. And obviously, if you've got something else to add, don't feel like you can't. But the last big thing I want to bring out here is that Paul does not go back again. He doesn't go back in, even though they said we'd like to hear from you later. He doesn't go back in because he recognizes that this is not he's throwing his seed on soil that is not interested. It's either you can either look at it from the standpoint, I like that, the standpoint of the parable of the soil, either the seed that's the road where it doesn't sink in at all, or it's the seed where Jesus talks about, I believe it's where the weeds come up and they choke it out real quick. You know, it doesn't have a chance to really take root and grow up on its own before other stuff, other ideas, other things get in the way and take it over. Either way, Paul recognizes this is a waste of my time. And so it's really important. I have seen this happen, and I've seen it. It's always funny when it happens from a missionary trying to do it to me, because I try to tell them usually, and they don't believe me, you know. But I've seen Christians chase after a dead end far too long. And I'm not talking about your family or your close friends or something like that. As long as you have a relationship with somebody, there is absolutely no reason not to keep on pursuing conversion. But if you're talking about just people who you're going out and meeting, or you're talking about people where you're developing relationships with them primarily for the purpose of evangelizing, continuing to chase someone who is absolutely not interested is not a good use of your time, because there's other people that are going to be more interested. So we have to learn both to recognize when people aren't interested and really aren't going to be interested, and also we have to develop this ability to say, you know what, I'm okay with not succeeding every time. And for some of us, that's actually really hard. I don't like to lose. I don't know if any of you have noticed that, but I don't like to lose arguments. I don't like to lose discussions. I don't like to lose, competitions that I'm involved in. And it's hard when you have somebody that just clearly doesn't want what you're selling to walk away and say, well, that's what God wants. Let's move on. It's hard to do that because our instinct says, I got to keep going back. I got to show them. I'm going to find the right thing to say, and it's going to be that one thing that's going to fix it, and they're going to believe now. And as long as I keep trying, I'm eventually going to get there. And sometimes it's just not true, and sometimes you just got to move on. Ian?
Jesus weighs in here. He said, and if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town.
Mm-hmm. And that is a symbolic gesture of saying, you know, you won't, basically, it's on your head that you won't listen. You know, it should never be, the one thing we can't ever do is say, I don't think they'll listen to me, so I'm not going to talk to them.
Yeah.
That is a mistake, because maybe you're right, but you don't make that decision. They make that decision, God makes that decision. But what we can sometimes say is, they aren't listening to me, it's time to move on to something else. Betty?
And we don't know when we are planting a seed that God's going to develop, make grow 10 years down the road. I've seen it.
Yeah.
You know, and our responsibility is to tell the truth and then let God work.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting with Paul is you can see he has that mindset. He's going to plant seeds and he's going to keep on moving, you know, because his job is to keep planting, planting seeds. And so he'll actually say things like, I planted, Apollos watered, or I don't remember baptizing very many people in Corinth. My job was to preach the word, and other people did the baptism. We tend to want to see the end of our labors. You know, we worked hard. We want to see something for what we did. We want to see the outcome. It's not necessarily that we want to see a reward per se, but we want to be validated in what we do. Our culture is very much about this notion of validation, of being told that you did a good job or you did it right or whatever. And when we don't get that, we feel like we failed, but that's not necessarily the case. Like you said, there's a lot of times that down the road, the things that we said matter later on. And there's other times where, you know, moving on is important because there's somebody else that's waiting to hear the gospel, and we wouldn't have known it if we'd stayed focused on that one person or that one group that won't listen. So we have to be willing to say, you know, we want to tailor our message as best we can to the people we're talking to. But we don't want to say that because we tailored our message perfectly, we have to get the right result or else we fail. Because that's not what this is about. This is not about getting the right result. This is about putting the gospel out there and letting God and his other ministers do the work that will come along and bring it to fruition if it doesn't happen immediately.
So I think I thought I heard somebody walking.
I do, but it's back there.
Okay.
Sneak we're dancing back.
So everyone seems to have a different idea on things, and it's interesting because when I was much younger, I felt that if you just presented the truth, people would understand it and they would agree to it. But that's not the case at all.
No.
And so, I mean, even Sue and I were just talking a few minutes ago, and she has a different idea on an approach to education or whatever. Even though we agree that it's both important, we maybe have a different approach to things. And this is true about people with faith, religion, the Bible, scriptures. And before we had kids and I was very young married, I was working at a place here in town. And every time I drive by the house, I still remember this conversation. So a couple of young men that were renting this house were getting some work done. And I was doing the work, and I can't remember why, but I used the phrase, rob Peter to pay Paul. Okay. Which is essentially means you're not going to gain anything by what you're doing if you're going to do that. And the guy says, well, wait a minute now. He says, that's an interesting thing you just said. And I go, oh? And he goes, are you a student of the Bible? And I said, well, we go to church and this and that. And I said, I didn't mean it to be a religious phrase, but he said, well, we have Bible class, or we do Bible study every Tuesday or something at 6 o'clock. You want to come over? And I said, yeah, I will. And because and Betty's probably the only one in the room that remembers Bill Hunt. And so Bill Hunt was our minister and was very much an evangelist kind of minister. He wanted to teach, he wanted to convert. That was his thing. And so I said, Bill, I got this thing, man. We're going to be able to go over there and tell these guys about the truth of the Bible and everything. So we showed up, and it was like they weren't expecting us. It was kind of weird, but anyway, they said, yeah, come on in. And they pulled up a chair, and so we started talking. And I had Bill with me because I didn't feel confident to do it at all.
Yeah.
And Bill, he'd the whole Bible memorized, you know. And so he started going along and teaching them stuff, and then we got into argument over the nuances of what conversion meant, what salvation meant, the pathway to salvation,
Right.
all these things, and I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
I mean, I really couldn't. I was sitting there going, why can't they hear what we're
It's so
saying?
obvious, what's wrong with it?
It's so obvious, and yet all they want to do is argue
Yeah.
over something that in my mind didn't even make sense. You're arguing over a nuance. And so we left, and I said, I'm sorry, Bill. He goes, hey, don't be sorry. I said, we planted the seed, and that's all we can do. And I said, oh, well, I thought we'd get somewhere. He goes, you never know. So anyway, you do. You never know. A kind word or a kind gesture or anything can lead to something later.
And you have to take advantage of the opportunities, even if it doesn't turn into something. You have to take advantage of the opportunities.
I was gonna say, just like Steve said, you never know. By living that good life and then knowing that you're a Christian and you do things different than the world does, people see that. We don't sometimes, because we are with our Christian brothers a lot, but we are out in the world a lot, and those people know us.
Yeah.
And they see us, and you never know where that, just our lives, our example, when somebody finally has a problem, they want to come to you and say, I have this problem, can I talk to you?
Mm-hmm.
Just that right there, because of your example, I think gives us those opportunities. Those doors are open now.
Mm-hmm.
And just by doing the right thing, and they're not used to that, because most people see the world as, I'm going to take care of myself, and I don't think about nobody else. And
Yeah.
when they need something, and hey, I need something now, where we could be the ones stepping in there. And I think it could be long way down the road, but then they come to you and say, hey, give me your opinion, or help me out. And I think we forget that our lives matter, and we are showing our lights. No matter what we're doing, our lights shine. And we may not think we are, but we really are.
Or if we aren't, people are noticing
Yeah,
that too.
that's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just say, like, everybody has a different approach, when you evangelize, if you will, and I mean, nobody should ever feel like they're not doing a good job. You try, you're out there, you're trying to be God-like when you're all out, and you hope people maybe ask a question, and sometimes you're going to approach them. So there's many different levels, but thinking about like Paul here, I mean, this is such a daunting task. I mean, it would be like one of us trying to go into a mosque and convert them, I mean, it's...
Get out alive.
Right, exactly, just the thought of that, it's finally at some point you're just like, uncle, I'm gone.
Yeah. And it's not like Paul is underprepared for this, but beyond even the fact that he is educated and he's knowledgeable in Greek and Roman culture as well as the Jewish culture, he also has the promise that Jesus had given, when you get out in front of men to speak, I'm going to give you the words to speak. So he has every reason to be confident, but still, it's you talking to a whole bunch of people who don't believe anything you believe. I'm reminded of when I was in law school at the University of Arizona, and there was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Rehnquist at the time, did a seminar for 2 weeks every year. The second semester of law school, he would do a seminar. You had to be a second-year student or third-year student to take the seminar, and it was held in this huge room, 150, 160 people could sit in there, and the class usually had 120, 140 students in it. The first day of class, this guy walks in, and he's this old guy, and he walks like this. I mean, literally, he walks like this. He's not moving very fast. He's got a badly mismatched sport coat, tie, and band combination, big, thick glasses, mostly balding on top. The only thing impressive about this guy is the two guys in black suits with the earpieces that are following around looking at everything, and those are Secret Service guys. But he gets up to the lectern, and he takes hold of the lectern, and he straightens up, and I could not tell you. I wish I knew how to do this, because it's like everything changed. Just instantly, everything changed. And he goes from being kind of this sort of laughable old man to being this presence. And when he starts talking, it's magnified. He has this deep, powerful voice for an older gentleman, a very, very powerful voice. And obviously the knowledge and wisdom just sort of drips out of what he's talking about. Ultimately, this class is about the history of the Supreme Court, which he is an expert in. He's not only because he's the Chief Justice, but because he studied the history of the Supreme Court even before he joined the court. And so he has a book that he's written that we're using as our textbook, basically covering the Supreme Court from the beginning up to the last justice who he did not serve with. So basically he's not going to write about or talk about in public because he believes it's inappropriate for the justices to speak about other justices and their decisions in public. He's not going to talk about anybody he actually worked with, but up until that point. So the history, basically it takes you through about the mid-1960s, late 1960s was when he joined the court, in the early 1970s. So he has us reading this book, and the first day he just kind of introduces the topic and talks a little bit about it, and it's going to be kind of a seminar in a way that most of our law school classes aren't. It's an old school kind of thing where he's going to ask questions and we have to stand up to actually answer his questions and stuff like that. And so he assigns us a reading, and the reading is the first. It's the most important early case in the Supreme Court history where the Supreme Court says that you guys, the court has the right to decide whether or not something is constitutional. We talk about that all the time. Now, whether a law or action of Congress or action of the President is legal based on what the Constitution's principles say. And the Chief Justice at the time, John Marshall, used a very awkward situation where if he'd come up with the wrong ruling, the President probably would have ignored it, but the right ruling was clearly not what the President wanted. He comes up with a way to come up with the ruling the President wants, using an argument that completely undermines what the President wanted the Supreme Court to be. So it's brilliantly done, but it's also a ruling that depends to a significant extent on some legal maneuvering that has some kind of dubious logic behind it. Anyway, he has us read this stuff. It's the next day we come back, because it's every day, and he asks the question, you guys all read welcome everybody, you guys all read the case, right? Oh yeah, we all read the case. Well, somebody tell me, what was the reasoning that John Marshall uses for this? And somebody gets up and explains that, and he says, well, I forget if he asked him or somebody else, well, do you see any problems with the reasoning? And the guy, now we're all second and third year law students, we know everything there is to know about law, because we've been in law school for a couple of years at least, So this guy, this is one of the first cases you study in constitutional law, this guy's like, oh yeah, it totally makes sense, clearly this is what it says. And so, and this is the first time he did that. Rehnquist took what the guy said, and I can't tell you exactly what he did to it. He changed it a little bit, or he took it like a couple of steps farther than the guy had actually thought all the way through of the logic. And he kind of restates what the guy says, the position that he took. And now, when he restated it, he ends it with, and you think this? And suddenly it's the dumbest thing anybody's ever said in the world. You're sitting there horrified, and this poor guy, he gets this deer in the headlights look, and you can tell he would just as soon crawl under the desk and die right then than actually continue to stand there, because he doesn't know what to say. And I have this thought all of a sudden. Okay, this guy, one guy, old guy in a badly mismatched suit and tie, is down there scaring all of us, terrifying all of us. Imagine if there were 9 of them in black robes and they're up above you asking you questions. That's what the Supreme Court is like. That's what appearing in front of the Supreme Court is like, magnified times 1,000. That's kind of Paul's situation. He's surrounded by all these people who are, philosophers, educated, have come from a very different philosophical background than the Jews do, and he's trying to make an argument to them. The reason I'm bringing all this out is this. We are going to be intimidated sometimes by the situations we find ourselves in from an evangelistic standpoint. We are going to encounter situations where people seem more educated than us, or seem to be hostile to us to some extent, or seem to be, coming from a very different perspective than we are. That doesn't mean that we should run away from those situations. It means that we have to kind of suck it up and deal with the situation, because God is putting those opportunities in front of us. And as more than one person has said, you never know how that's going to turn out in the short term or in the long term. And so we don't want to run away from opportunities when we're presented with them, even if we're not sure we can see how it's going to turn out the way we want it to, because that's not our job. Our job is not to figure out how it's supposed to turn out. Our job is to just put the seed out there and let God figure out how it's supposed to turn out. So, okay, any last comments before we stop here? Sue?
Well, sometimes just planting a seed of interest, if you can kind of see that it's being picked up on, then you can let that person go with it a little more, making it kind of their decision.
Yes.
Even my coming here, you didn't actually encourage me to come here, but you
You
were
have to tell
like,
everybody that.
I know you were kind of subtle about it, but I had total plans to be trying other churches, and this was just the first one. Doggone, I stopped right here.
That's how I work with the guy who painted her house this week too. First painter who came over, I really like him. I'm just going to hire him. We're going to try anybody else. Okay. I can't criticize since it worked for me, you know. So, all right. So we're going to take a break here. Do you guys want to know what pop culture point we're going to take a look at starting next week? Anybody want to know? All right. Yeah, you already figured it out because you saw that. So we're going to take a look at Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which has actually got some really good stuff in it from the standpoint of using it as a jumping point. Now, I got to admit, unlike Star Wars, which has permeated down to the youngest people in our societies now, Indiana Jones is not as effective when you get below about 30-year-old people. Most people under 30 do not have nearly as much familiarity with Indiana Jones as they do with Star Wars, because, I mean, most of the Indiana Jones movies came out in the 80s. The most recent one was not very good, and a lot of people didn't bother to see it because of that, and so there's not as much of an awareness. But if you're dealing with people that are close to your age or within 20 or 30 years of your age, you're probably going to be talking to them about something they're aware of. So we'll talk more about that next week, but for now, let's take a break.